The sky above Whitmore Aviation Academy was sharp and cloudless, the kind of day that begged for flight. Families crowded the metal bleachers, cameras lifted, voices hushed as the director took the podium in full-dress uniform. His silver hair caught the sun like polished chrome, and his words, rehearsed to precision, rolled across the crowd with the weight of a sales pitch. Near the back, away from the cameras and flag-bearing cadets, stood a woman in a faded flight jacket. The badge on her chest was scratched, the stitching frayed at the edges, but she stood still, shoulders square like someone who'd learned long ago that composure could be its own kind of armor. She didn't clap when the others did. She didn't smile when the jokes landed. She just watched. Director Derek Whitmore gestured grandly toward the stage behind him, where young pilots waited in crisp blue uniforms. He spoke of modern excellence, evolving standards, and the future of aviation free of outdated thinking. Then his eyes landed on the woman in the back. His voice shifted, colder, more precise. "We've even welcomed relics from a different era," he said, smirking, hoping they'd adapt. Some did. Others reminded us why the past should stay buried. The audience laughed politely. She didn't flinch. And then the jet came. It started as a low hum barely noticed beneath the director's monologue, but it grew fast, urgent, until every head turned toward the horizon. A sleek gray Rafale sliced across the sky, low and fast, its engines screaming over the crowd as it pulled into a vertical climb, so sharp the ground seemed to tilt beneath it. Gasps followed. Phones flew into the air, trying to catch the impossible barrel rolls and knife-edge turns. The aircraft danced, not with chaos, but control. Every move was precise, purposeful, like someone was painting with motion across the sky. As the jet circled back, something small dropped from its underbelly. A wooden box, compact and polished, fell toward the stage. It landed with a muted thud at Derek Whitmore's feet, kicking up dust. Security rushed forward, but the woman in the back didn't move. Her hands stayed folded in front of her. Her eyes never left the stage. The crowd, now silent, stared at the box as if it might speak. Derek bent down, hesitating. For the first time all morning, he looked unsure. His voice, full of control just moments ago, faltered as he reached for the latch. The jet was already gone. It disappeared into the distance, swallowed by mountains, leaving only stunned silence and the mystery it dropped from the sky. The woman turned away, not in triumph, not in protest, just as if she'd finally seen what she came for. The cabin sat near the tree line where the flat Montana earth began to rise into the shoulders of the mountains. It wasn't much. Just wood and windows and quiet, the kind of place where days passed without interruption, and no one came unless they were lost or looking for silence. Jo Rayner didn't mind. Her truck barely ran, her roof leaked when it snowed too fast, and her water heater rattled like it might explode. But each morning the light hit her table just right, spilling across the old Air Force badge that rested on a folded piece of cloth. She polished it with the same cloth every day, not because it needed to shine, but because the act reminded her of who had handed it to her. Her father's initials were scratched into the back. She could feel them with her thumb, each letter carved by hand the day she graduated flight school. The photo sat beside it, black and white and curled at the edges. He was younger than she'd ever be again, in full gear, standing beside a plane that barely looked real anymore. She used to think he looked tall in that picture. Now she saw how young he was. He died in the Gulf. Her mother never remarried. Jo grew up on bases, her childhood measured by deployments and returns, the rhythm of homecomings and absences. She knew how to pack a duffel before she learned long division. There were no medals on her walls, no plaques or citations. She had them boxed up in the closet, but they didn't matter here. What mattered was the sound of the wind through the pines and the feel of that badge in her hand. She didn't fly anymore. Not officially. Her last mission made sure of that. But sometimes when the sky turned gold in the early evening and the birds scattered low across the horizon, she'd close her eyes and feel it again. The weight of the helmet, the silence in the cockpit, the seconds just before the engines roared. She kept the cabin clean, lived on coffee eggs and old habits. There was a scar above her temple she didn't bother to cover, and a stiffness in her right hand that never quite left. These things were part of her now, like the gray streak in her braid, or the calluses on her palms. The town nearby knew her only in passing. She fixed fences for neighbors who didn't ask questions and helped the school bus out of ditches in winter. Most thought she was a widow or a nurse, or maybe just a quiet woman with a past she didn't feel like sharing. They weren't wrong. Every night before turning off the light, she placed the badge back on the cloth and whispered something only the badge would hear. Not a prayer. Not exactly. Just a promise to remember. She didn't cry often. Not anymore. But there were mornings when the fog didn't lift from the fields and the air felt like it used to on the tarmac, heavy and close. Those mornings made her chest ache in ways she couldn't name. She didn't call anyone. No one called her. Her phone stayed charged but quiet. It had numbers she couldn't bring herself to delete and voicemails she hadn't listened to in years. There were maps folded in a drawer. Not road maps, but flight charts. She still traced the lines with her finger, sometimes memorizing canyons, knowing where she would have gone if the world had let her keep flying. She never told anyone about that mission. Not really. There were things people didn't want to hear. Things they didn't believe even when you told them straight. So she stayed here, off the grid, off the radar. Just Jo Rayner, the woman with the badge and the coffee and the sky outside her window that always felt just out of reach. The call came in just past midnight. 11 Marines were pinned behind enemy lines after their helicopter went down near a border canyon deep in hostile terrain. Recon drones showed enemy forces closing fast, and there was no clean way to get in without losing more lives. Command said it was too risky. Helicopters couldn't make the approach, and fixed-wing support would light up on radar before they even crossed the ridge. Jo didn't argue. She just studied the terrain and found a line through the canyon tight enough to thread a needle. Her squadron commander called it suicide, but Jo looked at the map and saw only one thing. Time was running out. She checked her gear, climbed into her Raptor, and didn't wait for approval. The sky was pitch black. The canyon twisted like a trap, walls rising and falling without warning. Jo flew low, scraping treetops, letting the rocks swallow the radar signature. Her fingers never left the controls. Her breathing stayed even. She couldn't blink. One wrong angle and the jet would explode against the cliff face. Her flight computer screamed warnings. She shut it off. It was just her now. Her hands, her gut, and the map burned into her memory. She broke out over the target like a ghost. Enemy fire lit up the ground below, but she didn't pull away. She dropped a string of surgical strikes across the far ridge, scattering the line closing in on the Marines. She made a second pass, flattening the trail they'd need for exfil. The choppers got in, picked up every man, no losses, but Jo wasn't clear. On the return leg, climbing out through a narrow pass, a missile came out of nowhere. Intel hadn't flagged that position. The blast missed her engines but tore through the canopy. Shrapnel hit her helmet, sliced through her cheek, and shattered her visor. Blood poured down her face, her right eye blurred with pain and light. The aircraft listed hard systems failing and bursts alarms screaming from every side. She kept flying. No autopilot, no backup, just grit and memory. For nearly 40 minutes, she flew half-blind, one hand numb from shock, relying on instinct, and hours burned into muscle. She kept her altitude just high enough. She called out her position in code only one person on the ground would recognize. She never asked for help. When she landed, ground crew rushed the tarmac. Her flight suit was soaked with blood. Her hands wouldn't let go of the stick until someone pried them off. She was conscious. Barely. Doctors said the injuries were manageable. She'd lose some vision maybe forever, but she'd live. Everyone called her lucky. She didn't feel lucky. The investigation came fast. They said she disobeyed orders. They said she risked millions in equipment. They said she compromised operational integrity. The men she saved were never allowed to speak. Her commanding officers closed ranks. They wouldn't defend her. Her choice had embarrassed the chain of command. That mattered more than the lives she brought home. They gave her a quiet out, honorable discharge, no hearing, no press, just silence. She took it. Not because she agreed, but because dragging it through the mud would break more than her own name. She walked away without a word, and the story never made it past classified files. The base was quiet the morning she left. Her orders had come through fast, just a single line on official paper with her name and rank, followed by the words, honorable discharge. No ceremony, no handshake, just clearance to pack her things and go. She folded her uniform with care, smoothing each sleeve like it still meant something. Her locker held only what she needed. A pair of boots worn to the heel, a flight log no one would read again, and a black velvet box holding the Falcon badge. Jo stood in the doorway for a long time before locking it. Outside jets roared over the hangars, their sound steady, familiar, and distant. No one stopped to say goodbye. She didn't blame them. They were still flying, still part of the machine. and the machine didn't like broken pieces hanging around. Her father used to say the mission comes first even if you don't come with it. She remembered his voice more than his face. He'd been gone before she finished grade school, lost in a no-fly zone no one talked about anymore. Her mother never spoke much about that day, just told her to finish her homework and polish the badge. He had carved his initials on the back the day Jo earned her wings. He held it out to her in a hospital hallway, not a word, just that rough hand and the weight of something that had passed through war and blood and fire. Not because you're my daughter, because you earned it. She pressed the badge into her palm as she walked away from the hangars. The metal was cold sharp at the corners and dug into her skin like it meant to stay. She didn't look back. There were so many things she could have said, so many people she could have called out. But every word would cost something, not just for her but for the people still in the air. She kept the silence because she understood what it protected. It wasn't pride. It was the idea that some things are bigger than one person's truth, even when it hurts. Jo drove through the gates without salutes. No one followed. No one asked her to stay. She passed the flight line and the rows of parked jets, sunlight flashing off their metal skins like a goodbye that didn't mean it. That night in a motel an hour from the base, she opened her duffel and laid the badge on the nightstand. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep much either. The sky outside her window was the same color it always had been. She just wasn't part of it anymore. Whitmore Aviation didn't look like a place for second chances. The buildings were sleek, the windows spotless, and the hangars lined up like showroom models. Everything about it screamed precision, performance, perfection. Jo showed up in an old field jacket and boots that still carried desert dust. She kept her hair pulled back low and tight and said as little as possible during orientation. There were 23 others in the cohort, most of them younger, leaner, fresh out of shorter stints or dishonorable discharges they didn't want to talk about. The instructors handed out assignments on the first day. Most were given simulator training flight logs or digital coursework. Jo was handed a clipboard and told to report to Hangar 2 for maintenance oversight. When she asked about simulator hours, the instructor smiled and said the schedule would be adjusted based on observed discipline and compliance. She nodded and went to work. She swept floors, scrubbed hydraulic stains, and logged inventory for parts she could name by memory. The younger cadets passed her without looking at her badge. Some whispered, some laughed. One called her a museum piece under his breath. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. Someone found her name in a defense blog half redacted linked to a classified mission that never made the news. Others said she'd been kicked out for crashing a jet. Some said she never flew one at all. By week 2, someone posted a photo of her eating alone in the cafeteria. The caption read, "Washed up warbird still pretending to fly." It was shared on the Academy's private chat groups and got passed around with laughing emojis and fake salute gifs. She didn't respond. She ate the same meal every day, slow and quiet, then returned to work without complaint. One afternoon, she was asked to clear out the chemical locker while the rest of the group practiced aerial maneuvers on the new virtual rig. She wore gloves and a mask, her hands burning from the solvents, but she didn't say a word. On day 15, she finally got a simulator slot. When she entered the room, the instructor looked surprised. He said her controls had been custom calibrated for her age group. The group behind the glass chuckled. Jo climbed in and strapped herself down like she always had, checking the gauges, flipping switches in sequence. The simulation glitched halfway through. Her flight system failed, communications cut out, and the terrain tracking went dark. She adjusted instinctively, dropped altitude, and rolled out of the dead stick scenario with a landing that only looked messy if you didn't know how bad the software had been rigged. When she stepped out, the instructor gave her a slow clap. He said maybe piloting had changed since her day. Maybe newer systems needed younger reflexes. Her score was marked barely satisfactory, and no one looked her in the eye as they left the room. She walked back to the dorms alone. Her bunk was the bottom one by the window that wouldn't shut. At night, she heard laughter in the hallway, jokes muffled by drywall and arrogance. Once someone slid a photo under her door. It was the same cafeteria shot this time, printed with the words, "Glory, Days, Don't Pay Rent." She kept it, not because it hurt, but because it reminded her of what people forget. Rank fades fast when the uniform comes off. Most of them had never flown over enemy lines, never had to choose who made it home. They didn't understand silence the way she did. Every morning she got up before the others. She ran the perimeter trail with a steady rhythm and drank her coffee black facing the sunrise. She polished her boots even when they didn't require it. She folded her laundry tighter than the academy asked. Her locker stayed inspection ready, though no one ever checked it. One evening during rec hour, a younger woman from her unit paused by Joe's table. She didn't say anything, just stood there for a second too long before walking away. Her expression was hard to read. Maybe guilt, maybe recognition, maybe just curiosity. Joe didn't mind either way. Instructors called her a slow adapter. Administrators said she was distant. Her file was marked with terms like culturally rigid and better suited for independent tasks. No one asked about her record. No one mentioned the Falcon badge on her desk. The more they tried to forget who she was, the more she remembered. Not the medals or the missions, but the silence. The quiet places between explosions. The weight of choosing to fly into the fire while others stayed grounded. She carried it all the same. In her posture, in her patience, in the way she never rose to their bait. Not yet. Derek Whitmore liked his suits tailored, his ties silk, and his enemies humiliated in public. He ran Whitmore Aviation like a corporate summit, not a training academy. Most days he barely acknowledged the cadets unless cameras were around or donors were nearby. He didn't recognize Joe at first. Not until week 3 during a review of applicant files. Her name sat there plain and quiet. Joanna Rayner. A note flagged her prior service, her honorable discharge, and a sealed incident buried under a declassified label. Then it clicked. Years ago, his family's defense company had been the frontrunner on a multi-million-dollar avionics bid. They lost that contract because a pilot testified about faulty navigation systems during a classified investigation. That pilot was her. He didn't say a word the first time they crossed paths. He just stared a second too long, his lips twitching into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The next day, Joe was reassigned from hangar work to event logistics. Her task was to serve drinks at an executive gala. It was black tie and staged for the media. Cameras lined the corners, champagne flowed like water, and cadets were told to look polished and respectful. Joe wore the same uniform she had arrived with, sleeves pressed and collar clean. Derek handed her a tray like it was a joke. As she moved through the room, he raised his voice announcing the Academy's mission to uplift forgotten service members. He motioned to Joe, smiling wide, saying how proud they were to offer redemption, even to those whose better days had clearly passed. Laughter followed, a soft, awkward wave of it that echoed too long. Joe didn't react. She just kept moving, balancing the tray with a stillness that looked like grace from a distance and control from up close. Later that week, the Academy's press release included photos from the gala. Joe was in 2 of them, blurred but visible, her hands full and her posture perfect. The caption below one said, "Hospitality builds humility." It circulated quietly, mostly among donors and PR partners, but a few cadets saw it too. Some of the younger ones started to shift. The same girls who once laughed now watched more carefully. They saw how Joe never complained, never snapped back, never broke down, even when the pressure was layered thick and cold. Derek noticed, so he doubled down. He called her out in team briefings, correcting her in front of others for things she hadn't done. He assigned her to bunk maintenance and washroom duty during field weeks. At one point, he even implied her flight record had been exaggerated, suggesting she might have benefited from preferential treatment during her service. He said it without naming her, but everyone knew. Joe didn't argue. She stood where she was told. She did what she was asked. And every night she folded her badge into a hand towel and placed it inside her locker with the same precision she gave to a landing in a crosswind. She heard the whispers. She saw the smirks. But there was a shift now, subtle and slow. When Derek spoke, fewer people laughed. When Joe walked into a room, more heads turned. Not in mockery, in something like shame. Even the instructors grew quieter. They started skipping over her name during roll calls like it unsettled them. One afternoon, a flight instructor stared at her simulator scores for a long time before setting the file down without comment. It was clear Joe had become something they didn't know how to deal with. Not a threat, not a victim, just a presence that refused to shrink. Derek couldn't stand that. And so, he planned something bigger. The graduation ceremony was coming up. The media would be there. So would military brass and industry executives. He saw it as the perfect place to make an example of her. One final blow to shut the door on whatever legacy she thought she had left. He didn't realize that doors sometimes open both ways. The hallway was empty when she stepped out. just the hum of overhead lights and the faint scuff of her boots on tile. Someone had kicked something under her door and it had stopped just short of the frame. She crouched and reached for it without thinking. The moment her fingers touched metal, her stomach dropped. It was her Falcon badge, the one she kept wrapped in cloth inside her locker. Now it was covered in dirt and dust, the engraved wings smeared with grime. Someone had taken a key to it, scratched her name until only a few letters could be read. Deep gouges ran across the surface like they were trying to erase the metal itself. She stood still for a long time, holding it in her palm. The edges bit into her skin, cold and sharp. The hallway didn't make a sound. She turned it over. The initials were still there on the back, small, rough, hand-carved by her father the day he handed it down. The badge had crossed 3 generations. Korea, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. All of it sat in her hand now, like a truth no one could break. Her father's voice came back slow and steady. "Not because you're my daughter, because you earned it." She could still see him in that hospital hallway, standing tall, even with the cane, pressing the badge into her hand, like it meant more than any medal. She'd spent the last year trying to bury that legacy, trying to shrink enough to avoid notice, letting the comments slide, letting them paint her as something broken. But now the line had been crossed, not by the scratches, not even by the fact they'd gone through her things. It was the message behind it, the quiet cruelty, the belief that they could take something sacred and toss it like garbage. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just closed her hand around the badge and let its weight settle into her bones. That night she didn't go to the dining hall. She didn't go to sleep early. She sat on her bunk with her back straight and pulled out the old contacts list she hadn't looked at in years. The names were still there. Most were grayed out. A few had changed numbers, but enough hadn't. She started dialing. The first voice that answered didn't say hello, just breathed into the line and said they'd been waiting for this call. The second laughed like he couldn't believe it and told her he owed her more than just a favor. The third didn't say anything at all, just hung up, then texted coordinates. Jo kept the badge in her lap the whole time. She didn't polish it. She didn't try to fix the scratches. She just let it rest there, damaged and real. By the time the sun rose, the plan was already forming. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be angry. It would be precise, clean, and undeniable. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the silence to break on her terms. She wanted them to see what they had tried to bury. And more than anything, she wanted one girl in that academy to know the sky still belonged to her. The morning sky was clean and crisp, the kind of blue that felt too perfect to last. Rows of white folding chairs stretched across the tarmac, filled with polished shoes, sharp uniforms, and faces wearing practiced smiles. Cameras were already rolling when Derek Whitmore stepped onto the stage. He didn't look nervous. He never did. His voice rang through the loudspeakers, smooth and warm, the kind that had closed business deals and won donors without breaking a sweat. He talked about excellence, about innovation, about how Whitmore Aviation stood at the cutting edge of aerospace leadership. He praised the young cadets behind him, calling them the future of flight. Then his tone shifted. He spoke of the past, of traditions that had outlived their usefulness. He said some people still clung to outdated notions of glory, people who couldn't accept that the world had moved on. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The crowd followed his rhythm. Laughter where it was expected, applause on cue, a few exchanged knowing glances. Even some of the cadets behind him smiled, though their eyes didn't match their mouths. Jo stood at the very back. No uniform, just a dark jacket and quiet eyes. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She watched him like someone watching a clock run down. Derek kept going. He spoke about second chances, about how the academy had opened its doors to former service members who had struggled to adapt. He looked out over the crowd and said that sometimes you just couldn't save everyone from irrelevance. There was a pause then, just long enough for the insult to land. Jo didn't blink. Reporters shifted in their seats. A few turned cameras toward her, sensing something, though they didn't know what. The air felt tight, like the sky was holding its breath. Behind Derek, the cadets straightened. The final names were about to be called. The awards would follow. Then the aerial demonstration, something Derek had hyped all week. A flyover by one of their top grads. A show of everything the academy now stood for. Jo stayed where she was. Feet planted, arms folded, badge resting in her pocket. The light caught the side of her face, and someone near her leaned back, suddenly unsure if they'd misjudged the moment. Derek smiled again. That same smile he'd worn at the gala. Confident. Controlled. Like the ending was already written and everyone else was just reading their parts. The microphone buzzed slightly as he raised it again. He invited the audience to witness what real progress looked like, what leadership meant when stripped of sentiment. He said the future belonged to those who earned it, not to those clinging to faded memories. Then he looked right at her, eyes locked, smirk in place, victory in his voice. And for one long second the entire academy seemed to hold still. The roar came from nowhere. 1 second the tarmac was quiet, the crowd still caught in Derek's closing words. Then the sound hit like a storm, ripping through a valley, low and sharp, slicing through the sky above them. Heads turned as a fighter jet streaked into view, fast and impossibly low. Its wings tipped almost vertical, slicing through the air with a kind of reckless grace no simulation could teach. The ground vibrated underfoot as it pulled into a tight vertical climb, then rolled into a barrel turn that left the audience gasping. No one had seen it on the flight plan. Derek's face stiffened. He looked toward the control booth, but no one there made a move. The jet spun again, tighter now, carving a perfect figure 8 right over the Academy seal painted on the runway. Then came the light. From beneath the aircraft, a holographic array activated, casting shapes into the open air above the crowd. They blinked into view slowly, one by one. Amelia Earhart, Bessie Coleman, Jackie Cochran, the women who flew before they were ever welcome to. Their faces hovered above the formation like ghosts of the sky, proud, quiet, unshaken. The cadets stared up, mouths open, shoulders straightening. Someone near the front whispered a name under their breath like a prayer. The jet made one final pass and released a small wooden box from its underside. It floated down by parachute and landed softly directly at Derek's feet. He didn't move. He just stared at it like it had teeth. After a long second, an aide rushed forward and opened it. Inside were 3 things: a folded citation bearing the presidential seal, a photo of 11 Marines crowded around a hospital bed, grinning, arms over each other's shoulders, and a USB drive labeled with Joe's call sign. The aide rushed the drive to the presentation screen. The footage began without introduction. No music, no edits. It showed a Raptor tearing through a canyon too narrow for comfort, alarms blaring, warnings flashing across the cockpit. The flight path was suicidal. The strikes were clean. The choppers lifted out on time. Then came the missile, the canopy breach, blood on the dash, Joe's hands never leaving the controls. The crowd watched in silence as her plane limped through the sky instruments, flickering hull-scorched canopy open to the elements. She landed it like it was any other day. No flare, no panic, just precision. As the screen faded to black, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector shutting off. Then a single clap, slow, steady. A young cadet stood, tears in her eyes, hands coming together like she didn't know she was doing it. Others followed. One by one they rose, not for a speech, not for tradition, but because something in them recognized truth when it stood on its own. Joe didn't speak. She stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes on the horizon, face unreadable. She didn't look at Derek. She didn't look at the screen. She just stood there still, and certain, while the storm she had held back for years passed clean through the ranks in front of her, and somewhere high above the jet disappeared behind the mountains. Joe didn't wait for the applause to fade. She turned before the last hands came together and walked across the edge of the tarmac, her boots quiet against the concrete. The crowd didn't know whether to follow her with their eyes or look away. Someone called out her name. Another asked how she arranged the jet. A third shouted if she was coming back. She didn't answer. She didn't even slow down. She moved through the rows of chairs like they weren't there, past the cadets in polished uniforms, past instructors who suddenly remembered the silence they'd helped keep. Her steps were steady, unhurried, like she already knew where this part of the story ended. Near the back, a young woman stood frozen in place. She had been the first to clap, and now her hands hung at her sides. Her face held a mixture of awe and guilt, like she was trying to find the right words and didn't have any. Joe stopped in front of her and held out her hand. The cadet stared unsure until Joe reached into her jacket and pulled something small from her pocket. The Falcon badge sat in her palm, scratched and battered but whole. She placed it gently into the girl's hand and closed the fingers around it. The girl looked up, her eyes full throat tight. Joe leaned in, voice low enough that only she could hear it. "When you fly, don't let their noise drown out your knowing. You belong." Then she stepped back and walked away. No one tried to stop her. No one asked again. The crowd parted without a word, like even the wind had agreed to stay still for a moment. She passed through the academy gates and didn't look over her shoulder. The girl held the badge tight, her hand trembling. She looked around at the others, but no one spoke. Somewhere behind them, the projector screen still flickered faintly, the last frame of Joe's flight frozen in the light. Joe's silhouette faded into the morning glare, her figure shrinking with every step until she was just a shape against the sky. Not a soldier, not a veteran, not a ghost. Just a woman who had done what she came to do, and finally didn't need to explain it to anyone. The road curled through pine-covered hills, the old truck rattling gently over gravel and frost lines. Joe kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the open window frame, her fingers catching the wind. The sun rose behind her, spilling soft light across the mountains she'd always called home. She didn't bring much. Just a duffel in the back seat and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The cab was quiet. No music. Just the hum of tires and the occasional creak in the steering column. The memorial sat at the edge of a clearing tucked beneath a ridge where the sky always seemed bigger. It wasn't grand, just a stone marker and a rusted flagpole. Her father's name carved into the granite with the same simplicity he had lived by. She parked beside it and stepped out, letting the air settle over her. There was a stillness here that couldn't be found on any base or runway. She walked to the marker and touched the top with her fingers, letting her hand rest there for a moment longer than needed. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Everything worth saying had already been lived. For a long time she stood there and let the silence do the work. All the anger, all the doubt, all the weight of years spent shrinking and surviving it lifted. Not in a dramatic rush, but in the slow way a breeze carries smoke from an old fire. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cloth that used to wrap her badge. She let it go. The wind took it easily, pulling it into the trees like it had been waiting. By noon, she was back on the road. This time heading west toward a small airfield that trained search and rescue pilots. The job didn't come with medals or salutes, but it came with purpose. It came with people who needed someone who knew how to fly when everything else had failed. She wouldn't wear the uniform again. The flight suit was gone. The call sign retired. But she still knew how to teach others to find their way through storms. How to stay calm when the sky turned against you. That was enough. Her hands stayed steady on the wheel as the highway opened up ahead. No more missions. No more battles to win. Just a road that stretched wide and free, leading exactly where she needed to go.